Well, interesting, Brad mentioned to me, he said, well, we didn't really bring Dr. Andersen here to scare the bejesus out of everybody. But the reality is why I talk about these things is because the primary reason why all of you are farming is to make a living and raise a family and have a lifestyle that you choose to have. That's really what it's about. And so that lifestyle is affected by your health and by your family's health. And so if we can recognize that there are reasons for that problem, whether it's family health or a community health issue or so on, then we can do something about it. Because that's really what we're here to talk about is that, okay, now we know all these things, and what are we going to do about it? Because there is another model, and unfortunately a lot of people in the industry just tells you, oh, gee, more of the same is the only thing we can do. That's not true. But we need to know where we're at and how we got here in order to figure out how to get back out of it. And it really doesn't take quite as long as you think, but I will say I recognize, and I was talking to a friend about this. In fact, I was talking to a gentleman last night about this, Brad and his colleagues, that it is easier and more difficult at the same time today as it was in the early 1980s to do this stuff, to do this approach. It's easier in that we have more experience, we have more knowledge, we have more products that are great products available to us to do things in the soils that we didn't have then. At the same time, we have many more roadblocks today relative to toxicity out there. We've had more years of accumulated pesticides in the soil. We've had more damage to the soil, more damage to the environment. We have a more unstable weather pattern than we did 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So it's, as I said, it's more difficult and easier at the same time with that whole process. So it's always about cause and effect. Disease is not an accident either. Cancer is not an accident. And so I realize many people don't want to hear that because they also believe that conventional model that better life through chemistry. Yes, but it really needs to be nutritional chemistry, not pharmaceutical chemistry or other similar things. So what is the actual cause of constipation of the soil, compaction of the soil? It's at the molecular level. It's not at the macro level with those tractor tracks running across the ground. Because like the farm that my wife and I purchased, it wasn't tractor tracks, it was cattle tracks. It was rain. But the real issue is when you look at the calcium-magnesium ratio, it's very narrow. We have a heavy soil, we're about 26, 28 CEC, and we have in about an equal percentage of calcium as we do magnesium in the soil. So that at the molecular level is what causes or leads to compaction of the soil. Because at the molecular level then you set up plates that are held together very, very strongly. And literally, if we get a little bit of rain on the ground, it's like snot. And you walk across the field, you don't have to walk across the field, you walk 10 feet and you'll have a couple pounds of mud on your boots. That's at the molecular level. That's calcium-magnesium ratios at the molecular level. And so we need to change those. We have to change that not only with nutrient, we have to change that with biology. And so I'll give you an example though. We can't do it all with chemistry. In Australia, they have a huge area in central, west, and south Queensland and west northern New South Wales, that is their cotton belt. And some of you think that you have large farms here. An average farm in the cotton belt is 5,000 to 10,000 acres. There are many of them that are 25 to 100,000 acres of cotton. It's flat as a board for as far as you can see. We're talking hundreds of miles, flat as a board. And we're talking about cation exchange capacities from 25 to 70. Now, I don't know how many of you are really familiar with exchange capacities in clay soils, but a heavy soil in this region would be what, 25?
Yeah, maybe, up to 30.
Up to 30? Yeah. So you think that's a heavy soil, so let's go to a soil that's 50 to 70 exchange capacity. And then it actually has a higher magnesium percentage than calcium. So I saw some of those running 42 to 45% magnesium and 35-38% calcium. They are hard soils. And because we have an exchange capacity out there 50 plus, even 30, even 25, in order to change the exchange capacity ratio of calcium to magnesium, like Neil Kinsey says he wants to do, get it to 80%, 70 to 80%, you would have to apply carloads of calcium per acre in order to make that change. Well, theoretically to make that change. So on a practical basis, you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. You're only going to make that shift with biology and with the intercrop mix to address that. So one of the gentlemen there that I knew, one of the farmers that I consulted, that came to my course, he was in a cotton wheat rotation. And so he dumped the wheat and went to a cotton vetch rotation. Now these are all irrigated, by the way. You're talking 3 to 5 inches of rain a year. So you're not going to grow anything dry lamb. And they are typically also, they got some salt problems, so they got some sodium issues. And so they run their cotton crop. In the off season, then he'll plant 2 cycles of vetch. A month before it's time to get in the field for cotton, that vetch goes in, lets it set for a month, and then comes back with his cotton again. And what he found is he farms about 7,000 acres of cotton. And what he found is that the wheat anyway was pretty much a break-even at best for him. So his wife, he said, was very happy with him because now he can actually take a vacation with her. And because they're not out harvesting wheat. But he said his cotton production went up significantly, a half a bale to a full bale per acre, which more than compensated for all of any of the equipment or cost of putting the vetch in there, and the soil started to open up. So it can be done, and because his cash crop was cotton. Now also understand, this is long staple cotton. So that would be California and Arizona is Pima cotton, long staple. That's the higher value cotton. How many of you have been to Arizona or California where they're raising cotton? Okay, so what kind of yields do you think they talk about there as being, hey, gee, we did well here? Pima cotton. 2-3 bales an acre. You better get 4 in Australia, you don't break even. These guys are good farmers. And they're in difficult environments. It costs you 30% more across the board to farm in Australia than it does here. Because of taxes, because of fuel costs, because of all your inputs. It's just what it costs. So It can be done in very difficult environments, but you have to understand that biology needs to be part of the equation, because chemically you never will get it done. You can go out there with huge equipment. You're never going to open up that 50 CEC soil and get it to produce better. You have to get biology involved in that, and plants bring that biology with us. Yes?
So when you look at a soil test, what priority would you prioritize the calcium, magnesium compared to other data?
Good question. When I look at a soil test, what priority would I put calcium, magnesium? Very high. However, what's your exchange capacity? If I'm in a sandy soil, low CEC, let's say 5 to 10, 15, then I can physically change that ratio by the application of lime, calcium carbonate. But if I'm over 20, logistically, I can't really afford to put that much lime out there. Plus, I'm going to alter the biological environment if I put that much lime all at once out there in order to change that. So what I have to look at is what's my functional calcium, and that's going to be biology to get that going. So I'm going to go with smaller doses more frequently with the biology. At the same time, I'm going to look at my grass weed pressure, because grass weed pressure, foxtail, quackgrass, Johnson grass, those things, that tells me what my calcium's doing. And regardless of what the soil test says, if I have grass weed problems out there, now I know it's amazing how many farmers tell me, oh, we don't have grass weed problems. Okay, if you didn't apply the herbicide to kill those grass weeds, would you have grass? Oh yeah, we'd have it all over the place. We had a calcium problem. So that's how we interpret the soil test then, is what do we see growing out there? What's my compaction issue as well, and what's my grass weed pressure if I didn't go out and try to kill it all the time? All right? And that helps me to determine what I need to do as far as prioritizing that calcium-magnesium ratio. Because frequently also, the heavier the soil, the narrower your calcium-magnesium ratio, you also have magnesium deficiency. Because what we really have is an anaerobic system set up, and so we may actually have to get some magnesium in our foliars in order to address that out there as well. So, good question. So, why do we have soil compaction? Because we have a problem with biology and that calcium-magnesium ratio. So if we're going to actually change compaction, we need to change that at the molecular level. So that's going to be biology, that's going to be various plants that we may rotate into the system to get that done. So what's the cause of constipation? Is it a drug deficiency? Some people think it's an X-lax deficiency. I happen not to think so. So is it a symptom versus a cause? And so really, there's no accidents out there. You just have to really look at cause and effect relationships. And that's how we really solve things. And so it just talks here, why is soil compactable? And it all starts with nutrition, minerals, vitamins, amino acids, fatty acids, organic acids. All those things are fundamental and necessary for every living organisms, including the bacteria and the fungi that we may be applying out there or stimulating to grow in the system, because they're actually the biggest army. We really want to be farming the microorganisms because they're going to take care of the crop for us. They're going to take care of the crop. And the better we feed them, the microorganisms, the better they will feed our crop. The healthier they will keep our crop throughout that season. The better they will tolerate a drought or flood or excess moisture. Obviously, there are a range of tolerance here. We're not going to be able to tolerate 6 feet of water sitting on top of your field for a month. Yes, that's going to have to take some other intervention in order to solve that problem. At the same time, if you get 0 water for 3 months, literally 0 amount of rain, you're in a drought, okay, we have to address that, but that's actually a little easier to address than that 6 foot of water sitting out there on top of the ground from a flood. And so same thing with the diseases. They're there because there's a nutrient imbalance in the system. We'll talk about a couple of those when we get to the corn diseases here in a bit. All pesticides interfere or chelate out trace minerals. That's the way they operate at the molecular level. And genetic differences in disease susceptibility is really about nutrient balance. So it has to do with how that variety is interacting with the microbes and specific nutrient assimilation out there. So let's take a little bit look here as well. And what do we mean by that? Well, boron deficiency and membrane permeability. So what goes on, anytime you put a foliar spray on, you're feeding the plant, but what happens is that actually signals the plant to dump something through the roots into the ground to feed microbes to access various different nutrients in the soil. And so if there is a problem, an imbalance, those plants exudate, that they kick out, so it's going to be sugars and amino acids, the stuff that they kick out into the soil is not going to be appropriate for the plant. In other words, the plant's going to bleed. It's going to bleed. It's going to leak because there's not enough nutrients to hold it. So the example here is, if we have a boron deficiency, what happens to the plant? And so when we have that plant, and we have the roots below the ground, what's happening is that because of a boron deficiency, that plant is going to leak, because over here is a supply of boron, all right? And so we have deficiencies up to sufficiency. And what this is showing is how many micrograms of potassium, of sugar, of phenolic compounds, and amino acids are being leaked out into the soil. Now, why is that important? So we got potassium here, and we got the phenolics. We've got sugar, and there'll be other things as well. Amino acids, of course, out there. So why is that important? Because, and by the way, this is 1995 in Plant Physiology. So what's going on is that if there is sufficiency of boron, the plant is able to take all of this potassium, sucrose, phenolics, and amino acids and actually make plant mass. Actually utilize it to make plant, to make self. When the boron is deficient, it can't hang on to it. And the shelves in the cupboard are only so big. And photosynthesis maybe continue to go on. So it bleeds, it leaks through the roots into the soil, these various different nutrients that then, because they are out of sequence, feed the microorganisms. But they feed the pathogens because they're not going to be complete, and the pathogens see this bleeding. Oh my goodness, we got all this free, because sugar, particularly feeding bacteria, amino acids, depending on which the amino acids are. If they're real simple ones, they're going to feed the bacteria and the fungi. And so the pathogens are built up. They're fed. As soon as we solve that boron problem, that bleeding stops for the most part. Well, if the bleeding stops, that means we're not feeding the pathogens anymore either then. And the plant is healthier all around, just with a simple boron application. So when we really look at this whole process, it goes back to basic biochemistry. It's called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. That's energy production. So many of you are familiar with the word photosynthesis, but really, what is photosynthesis? And photosynthesis is where we take carbon dioxide from the air plus water, hopefully we got enough water, with the sunlight. And what do we produce? Sugar. And what else? Oxygen is released. Okay, those two things. We take that for granted. Oh, that's photosynthesis. What happens to that sugar in the plant? Well, ideally and most importantly, it produces ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the fuel, the electricity that actually drives the plant. Every cell in the plant, every cell in you and I. It's all about ATP production. That's energy production. It is completely dependent upon sugar production. Now, yes, in addition, some of that sugar is going to go to starch and fuel, just food for that plant. It's going to be utilized for making other things, organic acids, and so on and so forth. The process now by which this ATP is converted to all of these things, because in order to convert that sugar to starch, that sugar to other fuels, what do you got to have? ATP. ATP is necessary in that process. So how do we make ATP? That's what this cycle is about. And so why I put it up there is not for you to memorize that. We'll wait until the test at the end of the course here. I just put up B vitamins. B vitamins are necessary for that process to occur. Yes, there's a whole lot of other things as well, but just the B vitamins. So how many of you apply B vitamins in your NPK fertilizers? None of you? You assume that those B vitamins are just going to show up, or you assume they don't even apply. Where do we normally get those B vitamins? Microbes. They're the producers that the plant will take up. And many of them are made in the plant as well, provided there is enough building block for them to be manufactured. Yes, it's a complex system. It's a wonderfully designed system. And understand that this simple process, photosynthesis, we track that in the field with a refractometer. We want 12 and above at the weakest point of the plant. 24/7. That's our goal. So we continue to work for that, because once we get to that point, we're not going to have any issues with diseases and insects. Once you get that above 12 bricks, that corn plant, that bean plant, 24/7, you're not going to have any disease or weed problems. They're not there. So bees, we just talked about that a little bit there. Standard nutrition studies really don't look at things very well. We know the nutrient value is coming down. Several studies came out, 2006, 2001, 2004, and even before that, study back, I think it was 1991 or 92. This was the composition of foods. This is out of England. And vegetables and fruits, the decline in basic nutrients. How come? Well, it's because we're not taking care of business out in the field. That's what it's about. Disease toxins are common. Fusarium toxins are now common in all glyphosate sprayed crops and crops grown on soils having been sprayed with glyphosate. So we're having all kinds of Fusarium issues. Of course, Fusarium is not very good. You've got 3 different major problems with this. So fumonisin, you get heart failure in pigs, esophageal cancer in humans, vomitoxin, animals are going to go off feed, messes up their stomach, digestive system. Zearalenone is estrogen-like, and it causes precocious puberty in males and females. If you don't know what that is, that means that they develop puberty early. The earliest I've seen is age 6 in a little girl. Age 6. It's a little early. So Dan was talking, Brad was talking about, how many ears do we have? How many ears do we have and how many ears do we harvest? So the potential that we have, even practically, the potential we have is at least 2 to 3 harvestable ears. Yeah, it's definitely pie in the sky to think we're going to harvest 8 or 10. But on a practical basis, 2 to 3 is reasonable. So that brings us into the discussion of what is health. Well, I've divided it out really to 4 different levels. You should be able to discuss what the 4th one would be on the bottom. First of all, health. That's going to get maximum Brix, mineralization, nutrition, yield, taste, and it's naturally free of pests, parasites. We don't have to spray something on to kill them. It's just not there. Nature protects its own. The next is pre-disease. That's really where a lot of people are. That's where a lot of our crops are. It appears healthy. It's amazing to me how many times we'll see the farmer will just the day before, or a couple days before, they just went out and they just sprayed for insects or something, and then walk out in the field. Oh yeah, see, we don't have any insect problems. Oh, great, the plant's healthy. Well, that's an artificial healthy. That's really pre-disease because the insects are saying, no, it's not healthy. And so what do we see? It's kind of an artificial control of these organisms. So we look at the Brix. The Brix is not going to be 12. The majority of our crop production today, including most of our organic crop production today. And the other thing is that when you check your Brix readings on those things, typically if you check your Brix reading in the morning, you spray your, whatever it might be. If you're going to spray herbicide on, you spray your fungicide, spray your insecticide, and then about an hour or so later, go recheck the Brix reading. Typically, you'll find that Brix reading dropped after the application of those chemicals because they're chelating agents. They actually stress the plant. And then finally, we get to disease, which is we actually see things. We actually see that tar spot or that mildew or whatever it might be out there. What do you think the bottom one is? Death. Death. So health, pre-disease, disease, and death. Where are we on that scale? And it really is a balance between nutrition and disease. The two do not occur in the same context. So if we have a lot of disease, we have poor nutrition, unbalanced nutrition. Maybe we got a lot of excesses of one thing or 2 things or 3 things and deficiencies of other things, or functional deficiencies, because it's all about functionality. And so it's similar in medicine. We have to use the right form of nutrients in order to get the results. And agriculture, as a rule, wants to try to use the cheapest possible. And so that's why agriculture has been used as the dumping ground for industry. A lot of trace minerals come from spent acids. So they'll use sulfuric or phosphoric acid to clean metal before they paint it. It'll pick up the lead and aluminum and other things in it. But gee, because it was a phosphoric acid, they then can make a cheap phosphate fertilizer out of it and sell it to you, and they don't have to claim, oh, wait a minute, we're pulling a little lead with this, we got a little cadmium in here, we got a little aluminum in here. None of those, by the way, are nutrients for the plants. But of course, agriculture is a good dumping ground because you bought it cheaply. Therapeutic dosing, and that's another very important thing, and that is that we have to apply a quantity that is going to make the change that we desire. You understand that relative to your herbicide applications. If you only put out 1/10 the dose, do you get the result? So it's the same thing with nutrition. We have to have a therapeutic level of nutrition in order to get the changes that we need for that. And that is not always quantity, sometimes it's timing and functionality of the product in order to get us to that point. But nutrients are not drugs. And so drugs are never going to result in health. They only abate or suppress symptoms. So it's the same thing putting a herbicide out there, putting a fungicide out there, putting an insecticide out there, put a miticide out there. You haven't solved anything other than you've abated it until the next spray. And so it's the same. What are we going to select as far as the quality of our products? And so just because you put a biological fertilizer out there doesn't mean you're going to get results. The product itself may be fine, or the product may not be good. Do you know how to assess it? Do you have confidence in the people that are helping you with it? Those kinds of things. So this perhaps is the one thing you do need to memorize. And that is that looking at this scale of death, disease, pre-disease, and health, where are you? Where is your soil on this scale? So let's say, and most of you are going to be somewhere in this range. Most of you are going to be somewhere in that range. And so being in this range, what we want to grasp on this scale is that, let's say here's your field. Okay? Down here's death, of course. Up here's health. Right? So you purchase product A. And you apply product A. Oh, gee, it didn't do much for me. The product's no good. Doesn't have anything to do with the product, really. Product may be just fine. But the product doesn't increase your state of health. Let's say you purchase product B. Oh my God, it dropped my yield. It's a terrible product. No, not necessarily. It was just below your status of health. So let's say you purchase product C and apply that. Oh my goodness, that's the best thing since sliced bread. Wow, we need to use this forever. And over the years, you improve the quality of your soil, so now this is where you're at. And you purchase product C again, next year, boom, drops your yield. Oh, they must have messed up that product. I just can't get that quality product that I used to get. It used to improve the quality of our yield every year. Yeah, but if you were doing a good job of putting things together, you now have to go to product D in order to continue improvement. So if all you want is the status quo, that's fine for continuing the status quo product then. But if you truly are on an improvement program, you need to compensate every year to continue improving, which means if you are here and your neighbor is here and another neighbor is up here, are they going to be able to use the same product? Well, maybe they could try D, but the problem is that if they're down here, D may not be accessible to them. Because if you're up here and you're using D, I guarantee you that D is also a little bit more delicate of a product. And if you're putting everything else in here that's maintaining the status quo, you'll probably kill D before it has a chance of doing much help. Because it's not just chemistry, it's also biology that you're dealing with. It's also biology. It's also going to have to do with which variety you're growing, when you're getting it in, what kind of soil you have. So if all you're doing is the status quo, yes, if all of you are just down here at disease or pre-disease, yeah, it really doesn't make much difference. Just go ahead and continue doing the same old status quo thing. Continue using Iowa State or Nebraska, or Ohio State, or Illinois. Yeah, go ahead and use their soil testing and their recommendations, because it doesn't really make any difference. There isn't any science behind it anyway. It's all just status quo to maintain the lip service to continue your using the chemical industry's approach. It doesn't make any difference. It's not going to ever get you up here. So understand that depending upon the quality of the product, you have to match that to the health status of your field and your crop. And your crop. It's the same thing with your own personal health. Same thing with your own personal health. Same thing if you're raising animals. Same thing with them. Where are they? And so a product that might be just fine for the status quo, if your animals are in better health, giving them the status quo stuff is only going to decline their health. You have to continue improving the inputs in order to continue raising the bar, so to speak. All right? Yes, sir?
Is this why a lot of our soils have a hard time switching from anhydrous ammonia to a better form?
Good question. Is this why a lot of the soils have difficulty switching from anhydrous to better form? Yeah. What's happening is you're using a sledgehammer, essentially. Anhydrous is a very strong alkali. And so what happens is that alkali is very effective at extracting nutrients. There's a huge consequence to that in that it's burning out the carbon, burning out the organic matter over time, the humus over time. We've got to play on words here a little bit with organic matter versus humus. It burns out the humus, which actually the humus is full of trace minerals, so that releases those there. So that's why you continue to see some improvement. The reality is that what we have to do is, one, we have to change varieties, and two, we have to then get the biology to go in there to help us hold whatever nitrogen we put out there. Instead of using a sledgehammer, we use just a ball peen hammer out there on there. But yes, good question on that. Okay, so knowledge is power, so we have to get a clear understanding of how food is produced and move along with that. And so nutrition, we've already talked about that a little bit, so I don't want to belittle this a little bit. Again, root exudates, I did the one on boron, and so this one is zinc. So if we got a zinc deficiency, sufficiency, deficiency. So this is zinc sufficiency, zinc deficiency. And what is being dumped in amino acid, sugar, and phenolics out through the roots. So you see it's bleeding. Red, bleeding. It's bleeding in deficiency states. The cotton, the wheat, the apple. We're bleeding nutrients into the soil. So we have to solve that at the, foliar level is a good place to address that. So aphids and mites, healthy plants, we want to just kind of move along here. That work, Schabosa has already talked about. We know that insects are just there trying to pick up free nitrogens in particular. And I know Brad has done some testing with Nova Crop Control, and several years ago we had them test, and they collected enough data and finally proved it in greenhouse work over in the Netherlands, that as soon as the sap reaches 55% nitrate nitrogen out of total nitrogen, you will have aphids feeding. Doesn't matter what else you do. You will have aphids feeding. Not until. Because that's what they easily digest. And so what that means is that you're low in sugar. So your Brix readings are going to be too low because you can't convert that nitrogen to an amino acid. It takes sugar in order to convert that free nitrogen to an amino acid. And you don't have sufficient sugar to do that, which means you're not sufficient nutrition to do that. And so you will continue to build up more and more nitrate nitrogen. And when you get to that 55%, you have aphids, and they're feeding. And it doesn't matter how many times you spray them, because you haven't done anything to change the table. You're continuing to serve their favorite food. So we have to continue a new paradigm with that whole process. So we've already been through this a little bit. Look at the salads and foods today. Mineral depletion, even in the 1960s, it did spectral analysis of 4,000 grain samples. And what they found was, they continue to drop in basic nutrients. The 1960s. So we're not talking about just today, 2020, that, all of a sudden we got deficiency. It's been going on for 100 years. And so herbicide-resistant weeds. Here we go here chronologically around the world. So tell me how successful herbicide use has been. Oh, we're still farming. Yeah, but it's becoming more and more difficult. Have to use more and more herbicide. Have to figure out other ways to address it. It just continues to go up. Here's a list of a number of herbicide-resistant species. And there's many, many others. You can go to that website and you can see them. They just continue to increase more and more. Roundup as well, more and more what it does. Here's the steroid pathway from cholesterol. This is in mammals and so on. Comes down through and inhibited by various different things. Pesticides down here and that conversion of estrogen. And so we end up getting out here into some things that we don't want. That's why we can get cancer from it, because it's an endocrine disruptor. And weeds, this is one really difficult for people as well. How are we going to solve the weed problem if we can't use herbicides? And there's a lot of people that do, but understand that it's basic geological science. So, how can we figure that out? Well, actually the Norwegians did, I think it was the Norwegians, it was Scandinavians, and I believe it was the Norwegians, actually did this original work. Now, Elaine Ingham also did some of that work, but the Norwegians did it before she did. And what they found was they went to bare volcanic rock. You can find those places around the world easily. You can go to Hawaii, the big island in Hawaii, you can find fresh volcanic rock. As well, if you've ever been to the big island in Hawaii, there's several years worth of lava flows, major lava flows. One in 1968, 1954. And so what they did was they went and analyzed those various different volcanic flows and evaluated who was showing up first and who showed up next and next and next and next, all the way through mature forests. So start out with bare rock, fresh volcanic lava flow, all the way out to now who do we have in these healthy forests. Unfortunately, we're getting fewer and fewer healthy forests anymore. And what they found was that, first of all, bacteria show up. That's the first guys on the scene. As bacteria start working and etching away at that, we start seeing mosses and lichens and various other things, and then we start seeing small little shrubs and various other things. And then across here, finally, we get to some upright plants, and we get to primitive grasses. You know, the primitive grasses like foxtail and quackgrass and Johnson grass and those kinds of the primitive grasses. Because then we get to the prairie grasses, our fescues, for example. And what we find when we do the analysis of biology in the roots, we see that it's the fungi that start coming in here. But these fungi down here in these primitive grasses and first upright plants are dominantly what we classify as pathogens, because they're more capable of surviving in those more difficult environments, more anaerobic environments, until we get out to the prairie grasses. And now we start seeing particularly mycorrhizae fungi showing up. Mycorrhizae fungi are all the crops that you're growing, well, corn, beans, and wheat, so on. Those are all mycorrhizae dependent plants. And further and further we get out here, all the forests are mycorrhizae dependent fungi plants. In other words, in order for them to be truly healthy, they have to be completely coated with mycorrhizae around the roots. And so what's happened is with our soils, in many of these areas, these are prairie soils. In a lot of areas in the Midwest, you go back 250 years, they were prairie soils. And so at that point in time, they were rich in beneficial fungi, rich in mycorrhizae. And what we've done over time is that we have moved them, geologically speaking, to the left. We've moved them more primitive, to a more primitive biology. And a more primitive biology is more conducive to weeds. Number two, some of you have already recognized this, you've already seen this, and if you're working over time to improve these soils, you will see it. And that is that the insects begin going from consuming your crop, corn and soybeans and wheat, to they begin consuming the weeds. That's one of the early changes that we see. Leave the crop alone, they start consuming the weeds. And then we don't have the weeds. The weeds change. First of all, you're going to start seeing changes in weed species in your fields. And then the insects going after them. And if you check the Brix reading, you start checking the Brix readings in your weeds, you'll notice that those are also declining over time. And so the way that we really address the weed problem on our farms is a biological shift in the soil. That's how you solve it. Now, logistically, how do we get there? And that's up to you. And that's what these gentlemen talk about as far as, how do they do it on their farms? But just because it works on their farm doesn't mean it exactly works on your farm. You're a different manager, so you may have to integrate some other things into that process. But that's how we're going to solve those weeds. And this is a Scandinavian research if you wish to go and actually find it. So there's a couple nice videos out there too. Life in the Soil, it's a great one. Shows you how the biology is working and feeds on the roots and so on. This is interesting as well, just talking about controlling weeds based upon the carbon in the soil. This is work done out of Ohio, and what they found out is that if we improve that carbon-nitrogen ratio in the soil from a 25-to-1, which is pretty common, up to 3 times that, We reduce broadleaf weeds by 75% doing nothing else. Not tilling, not doing anything else, just by changing that carbon-nitrogen ratio in the soil, which means we've got to do some biological things appropriate for that to happen. We automatically reduce broadleaf weeds by 75%. Why is that? Because of this. Because as we move to the right here, we're getting more bioactive carbon in the soil. So automatically, we're reducing these first upright plants. We're reducing their ability to function out there in the soil over time. And so as well, this whole concept of thinking, oh gee, I left all that residue out there, I'm improving my soils. Not necessarily, not necessarily. And in fact, what they've found out is that in a lot of these no-till areas, a lot of the GMO stuff, you aren't improving at all. And because it's not getting actually converted to humus. You may have organic matter there, but it's not humus. It's not actually feeding the plant, the next plant out there. Weed susceptibility here, this just has to do with just pH alone and a local pH. What do I mean by local pH? A pH right at the root, as opposed to pH generally in the soil. As well, these are just some pictures. How are we doing on time?
We're very good on time. We're gonna need to probably 12:30 or a little bit later to allow
Yep.
you to get through what you need.
What
to.
time is it?
So it's 20 to 12.
Okay,
We got plenty of time.
that's easy for you to say. So here's some pictures we want to look at. Soybeans and wheat. We got some take-all problems, and this is all from glyphosate residue. These are complements of Don Huber, by the way. Citrus variegated chlorosis, same thing. This is glyphosate in the soil. It ties it up. Again, iron chlorosis out here. And again, here's what we see with nutrient density between GMOs and non-GMOs. And what we're seeing in the GMOs is we're also seeing some formaldehyde residue in those. And of course, that gets dumped into the animals who consume that. And also then guidelines for formaldehyde. It's not a nice thing. Here we go.
Go back 2 slides to your nutrient density.
Yeah.
Look at the calcium level differences. Look at the bricks level differences. Once again, just because we go apply something, whether, especially in terms of fertilizer, has never and will never guarantee it becomes plant available. We have to have a functional system to allow these things to happen and occur properly. Calcium is where it starts. Calcium is king. We don't often look at it in that manner because we're told it's all just about NP and K. Go put it on, go spend your money. But this is one of the reasons for years we have said the most waste of money that we as farmers spend in a given year is on phosphorus and potassium. Too many times we spend money on products that almost immediately get tied up in the soil. And then we don't have the proper mechanisms to make it functional and plant available. Thank you.
The other thing that you see here is that this is not only the corn. You harvest the corn was harvested, obviously, for them to go and get it tested. But that also reflects what's the quality of the residue that you're putting back in the ground. So the non-GMO one, not only do we have a better crop that we're selling to the farms, other farms, animal operations and so on, you have better residue that you're putting back in the ground. So we're more than multiplying. It's not just an equal amount. If you put a ton, if you have 1 ton of this residue versus 1 ton of this residue, they're not equivalent as far as what it's doing to help improve your soil the following year. So that's why it becomes a snowballing effect for the benefit. It becomes a snowballing effect for the detriment, depending upon which side of the spectrum you are on. So glyphosate in the human urine, it's there. We have it all over the place. And I can tell you from personal experience, my wife and I are pretty strict on eating organic foods as much as we can. In Kansas City, we're fortunate. We have Costco and a number of other places that actually have reasonable quality stuff. And 3 years ago, there's a lab in Kansas City called Great Plains Laboratory, and they will do human testing, urine, blood, for various different things. So we decided, well, let's just see how much pesticide we're spilling in our urine. And so we did both a complete panel of pesticides as well as specifically glyphosate, because that was an added test. And so both of us were spilling both in urine, pretty significant amounts. My wife more than I, which was interesting. And that's the difference in her ability to detoxify things. That's a genetics issue then, because she's even more strict than I am relative to those things. So she's not eating things that should have glyphosate in them. But obviously most of the things still do have glyphosate in them. And so we know from personal experience it's in the urine. It's in the urine. And so people who don't even care at all, significant amounts in the urine. And so here as well, mean urinary glyphosate, 3.4 parts per billion. So I like to play little games with this once in a while as well, because the industry likes to tell you that, oh my gosh, it's in such small quantities it couldn't possibly be a problem for you. They depend upon, just like the statement that Brad said, they depend upon your ignorance of science in order to be able to tell you nonsense like that. They depend upon your ignorance. And I'll get to that in a minute, because I'm going to show you how much active testosterone you men have in your bloodstream. So when you want to talk about parts per million being such a small quantity, parts per billion's way out there, oh my God, parts per trillion, you think, oh, that doesn't even exist. You'll see that it does. So the usage recommendations, this is a product, Razor Pro herbicide, active ingredients 41% glyphosates from New Farm, and these are the recommended rates out there. So I did some calculations with the math. Let's do a little bit of math out there. And so if we're going to put 48 ounces out there, that is 600 parts per billion. And so if I am applying that in 20 gallons of water, I'm ending up out here at about 0.0034 parts per million times that number of ounces. So essentially I'm putting out 0.08 mils is what we see in women's urine. Great. And that is 0.0034 parts per million. But wait a minute. We're actually putting out there 617 parts per million of actual herbicide. So your hormones, let me see. The desired amount of vitamin D in your serum is 30 to 100 nanograms per milliliter. That's parts per billion. And men's testosterone is 250 to 875. That's the reference range, nanograms per deciliter. Women's estrogen is 990 to 590 picograms. That's parts per trillion. So the hormones that make you men or women dominantly are circulating in your bloodstream in parts per billion and parts per trillion concentrations. So when somebody tells me that circulating glyphosate at 1,000 times that in your bloodstream has no effect, they're FOS. You see, I have an advantage as being a physician and also an agronomist. I know a little bit of science. And so why I showed you the video on the endocrine disrupting, because it has become a huge political juggernaut about gender dysphoria in this country and around the world. Where do you think that's coming from? It's coming from endocrine disrupting herbicides and pesticides that are at higher concentrations than the hormones that naturally circulate through our bloodstream. So there is a consequence for everything that we do. The cancer rates, the Parkinson's rates in farmers is ridiculous. The miscarriage rates, the birth defect rates in rural families is ridiculous. Why are we doing this anyway? You're farming for a lifestyle. You're farming for a lifestyle. You may have grown up in it. It may be what you thought that was the only thing you knew. But if you become successful, you're doing it because of a lifestyle. You like the farm lifestyle. You're not going to be very happy, most all of you know, if you can't pay your bills. That's not a very good lifestyle. So the only good farm lifestyle is if you can pay your bills. But if you can pay your bills, but you die at 45 of liver cancer, how good was that lifestyle for the rest of your family as well? So we can do something different about these things, and that's why we talk about these, of how important it is. We've already been through those things, so I don't need to go through that again and again. So what we want to start with is getting out into the field and testing the field. So how are we going to make these changes? Where do we start? First of all, we get out into the field. Well, maybe we go with somebody like Brad or his colleagues, or maybe someone else you know, a consultant. Get a hold of some tools. You get a penetrometer. You get yourself a refractometer. Well, a refractometer is not going to do you much good this time of year, but a penetrometer is. You can get out there with a penetrometer. You can get out there with a shovel. You can get out there with a thermometer. You can look at those parameters today. And so the soil test quality kit, we're getting out there with a soil respiration. That's a little kit that you can get that actually checks for CO2 respiration. So what you do is you get a sample of soil, you put it in this little container, and you put a little dipstick thing in there that goes with it, put a cover on it, set it for 24 hours, it changes color. And the color change tells you how much respiration is going on. What's respiration? How much biology you have there. So it's a general check over time. It's not something I'm going to check every week, may not even check every month, but certainly I'm going to check every season potentially on that. Water infiltration, what is that? So I take, for example, a quart tin can. That may not be strong enough to get into some of these soils. You may have to take a 6-inch piece of PVC, file the end of it so you got a nice wedge in it. You drive that into the ground at least 6 inches. Be better if you can go in about 10 inches. You have calculated in that 6 or 8 inch pipe how much water is 1 inch. So you measure out that much, and you have a stopwatch. You dump that water in, hit your stopwatch, and you time how long does it take for that 1 inch of water to infiltrate into the soil. And then once that's done, you put a 2nd inch in there, time it. How long does it take for that 2nd inch to infiltrate? What does this tell you? How well you're going to survive a 2-inch rain. How well you're going to survive a 1-inch downpour. Is it going to soak in, or is it going to end up out in the river with half of your nutrients? water infiltration correlates to, one, how compact is the soil, how much biology, how much organic matter do we have in there. Because organic matter, actually humus, not just organic matter, humus holds about 4 to 1 its weight in water. So you increase your humus level out there, you'll have faster infiltration. Next, we're looking at bulk density, so we're actually weighing a given volume of that soil. We're checking the pH, the EC, which is electrical conductivity, and we're doing a nitrate test. We're doing a slaking test. In other words, we're taking some of the clumps, we're dipping them in water and seeing how fast they break up in the water. And then we're doing counts of critters. Do we have any earthworms out there? Probably this time of year may not have too many, so it may not be the best time to go out there and do that. But certainly in the summertime, you can get out there. Hey, what do we got for earthworm counts? In many fields today across the United States, around the world, you're not going to find any earthworms. So that's a pretty quick test. 0, next. So then that's our soil. Now, the other things you can add to that, what does it smell like? Does it smell chemically, or does it have a nice foresty aroma to it? What does it feel like? So you can do some of your standard soil tests, making a soil ribbon and those kinds of things. You can do that as well. That doesn't change much, though, over time. These things are things that are going to change from year to year as you either decline or improve your soil. And particularly with the weather as squirrely as it's been, that water infiltration issue is very important for us because we're getting more downpours in various areas around the country. So how well is our soil going to tolerate that versus the neighbor or versus us before? So we're going to do, I already talked about those things then. We're doing the water infiltration, the temperature, the pH, EC, the CO2, the slaking, the texture, the structure. We're doing a bricks for the sap one. We're checking the penetrometer. And if you want to actually look for that, you can go to the USDA.gov and you can get all that information off from there. So that's Michael McNeil's. He developed it when he was at USDA, and that kit is still well available. So soil testing, there's several different ones that you can use. And again, it's interpretation along with what do you see in the field. It's just like if I do a lab test. Lab tests are nice on people, and I use them. But I've had so many patients come in, gee, your lab tests look pretty good, but doctor, I feel terrible. Your lab tests are good, but doctor, I feel terrible. So the conventional perspective on that is okay, well, here's some Prozac. Here's your antidepressant. Here's your anti-anxiety drug. Because your labs show you're good. You must be just depressed. That's the standard approach. So just because the lab test says you're okay, wait a minute, that lab test was invented by man. You don't feel good. All right, we need to figure out what else is going on. Same thing here. We're doing these various different tests. We need to get out in the field. That's why we have that previous kit that I showed you. You get out in the field. What do you actually see? Your soil test may say, hey, everything is hunky-dory. Yeah, but we got weed problems. We got soil compaction problems out there. We may have rootworm issues. We may not have yields that are anywhere near what we should be getting. We've got a problem with water runoff. Those kinds of things are what you're going to visually see, don't necessarily show up in the soil tests. So typical mining assay, your typical university test, the Reams-Morgan test is something developed by Kerry Reams, but originally it came from Ireland. And the reason they used it as a Morgan extract, what they found out was it gave them a better functional phosphate level, which was very important for them because the more common fertilizer that they use in pastures is superphosphate in those countries. So functional nutrient basics, if we're looking at that, on the Reams test, I want that 2 to 4,000 of calcium, the phosphorus at 2 to 400, potash at half that, and you think, oh no, we got to use more, we always use more potash than we do phosphorus. True. That's consumption. That's consumption. What you have to recognize is that phosphorus is recycled. Phosphorus is recycled. It's like the railroad car. Takes things back and forth. The potash is going to be consumed. And so yes, you're going to consume more pounds per acre of potash, but in order to be able to do that, we have to have a therapeutic level of phosphorus in order to make that happen, as the transport mechanism, as the energy mechanism to get that to happen. We want equal amounts of nitrate and ammoniacal nitrogen. And what you'll see, that also is a nice biological indicator. Can I get some more water, please? Because what will happen is that it's easy to get nitrate nitrogen. Well, you can get some ammoniacal too if you apply anhydrous, but it's not stable. It doesn't stay there. How many of you have driven by in the springtime and smell ammonia in the air? That fertilizer is not going for the crop, that's back in the air. It's because it's not stable, it's not tied to a carbon. So what you will see on these soil tests is that as the soil improves biologically, this ammoniacal nitrogen comes up. Because a lot of times, if you go throughout the season, you track it throughout the season, the further away you get from an ammonia application, the lower that ammonia nitrogen shows on your soil test. It only comes up as we get biology and stably, because we want this 24/7. These are not soil tests, okay, we show up one time in the year and that's great. No, that's 24/7 that we need to have those numbers. Just like using the refractometer, that needs to be above 12 24/7. And so the same thing with this, that's 24/7. So if we look at the standard test, we're looking at more percentages. So if we look at the Albrecht or Kinsey and some of those guys that are doing that kind of stuff, and that's good information. I don't have a problem with it. It's how you interpret it, how you're going to use it. This actually gives us some numbers that we can do on a regular basis. This is going to be kind of an annual thing, and it gives me, it's sort of like, what are my capital assets? And this is more, what's my cash flow that I'm going to pay the bills today for or with. Other testing, of course, there's other labs around that you can use. I'm not so tied up in labs as I am interpretation of those correlated to what do we see out there in the field. So again, that functional qualities, that bricks 24/7. Calcium, we need it for a lot of different things. Brad's already alluded to that, mentioned that. You could go through these of all the things that it's for. It's a cell wall binder. It's needed for chromosome activation. It is very important as a second messenger for making these various different enzymes. You have to have it. It's the foundation. That doesn't mean that we're going to actually consume more than potash or magnesium or some of those when we analyze that crop when it comes off the field. But calcium has to be there in order for the other things to work, just like the phosphorus. So we're talking about things setting the foundation so that we can improve those yields overall. It's a very important communicator. So to get that message that we are going to need to put on potash, what I mean, I don't mean put it on the soil, to put it on in the plant, we have to have calcium in order for that to occur. It's a second messenger, and there's been a lot of research out there on that. And so a total foliar mass was greater under heat stress than the controlled conditions when we had higher calcium levels. So one of the problems that you see with squirrely weather is drought and flood. So we get under heat stress, and particularly in small grains, if we have a lot of heat stress, we don't get good pollination. We don't get good pollination of corn if it's too hot and dry. Correct? Well, that depends upon what your calcium level is. Depends what your calcium level is. The better your foundation calcium, the better your crop handles heat stress. So the better pollination you're going to get under heat stress conditions. So it's true we don't know exactly what the weather's going to be, but if we prepare by getting our nutrients, we handle whatever stress better. And so this is just a graph of that. You can go to those websites and look at that. It's very important. This just talks about that graph, what that graph is. So this the schematic of it. And by the way, if you want to get some of these things, make it available here to Brad so you can look these up further if you want to. And do further research on those. Another thing, calcium is very important, protects against reactive oxygen species. So again, what's that? That has to do with free radicals, essentially heat stress. Essentially heat stress. And so again, calcium is protecting us from that heat stress. It also counters nitrogen, so it allows us. What happens is that if we have a good level of calcium, we don't have that excess nitrogen problem, which means also, guess what? We don't have the aphid issues. So it's a good detoxifier. It does counter heavy metals, so if we got that problem out there, it helps us to utilize our nitrogen better, and it's very important for growth. And so we're going to get into that in just a moment, but it is very important for growth. There is a growth factor obtained in water extracts of many plant tissue. This factor was shown to be calcium ion for the growth of the pollen tube. So it goes back to what I said, how can we handle heat stress for pollination? Well, if calcium is the key growth factor involved in pollen tube germination, guess what? If you don't have enough there, you don't have very good heat stress or any kind of stress for that pollination need. Bacterial diseases as well. The better your calcium is, nutrient levels, the high level of calcium can affect nitrogen. So it's that free nitrogen that really calls in a lot of these insect problems. So getting now into that, what I said, this male-female thing, boys and girls, you can affect that. You can directly change it. And some of you may or may not have times where, I could have said this to the previous generation because most farmers used to have a garden and not very many farmers have gardens today. But in your gardens and you have all the tomatoes growing, real tall vines, but no fruit. Some of you may have seen that in your soybeans though. Gee, you have great plants growing, but not very much pod set. Or the internode distance is great, much greater than you want. Well, that means you got too much boy and not enough girl in there. That's really what that means. Too much boy, not enough girl. And that's this whole energy management process. And calcium is the foundation. So the better we have our calcium set up, the better this foundation we have, the more easily we are to affect boys and girls. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that in the early part of the season, we want to be over on left of center here. We want to be growing. We're growing the plant. But as soon as we need seed set, we need to be over on this side and to carry it out throughout the end of the season. Because we need to set that fruit or seed and we need to keep it there. We don't want to drop it. We don't want to lose it. That has to do with the stability of it staying there, has to do with how much calcium we have over here. So let's say that, gee, we just can't get those rascals to set, or our internodes are way too far apart. What are we going to do? Some people say, oh, I just need to put out a growth regulator. Yeah, but the foliar spray could be a growth regulator, should be. So out here then, what are we going to put out here to set fruit or to get this to move, to release energy? Well, some very simple things. Gee, we're going to put a little phosphorus out there. We're going to get some ammonia nitrogen out there. We're going to put some vinegar out there. Estrogen equivalents to get that to set fruit and to hold fruit. And the art of this is to keep it over here enough to maintain fruit set, and very much you would see that in fruit trees and garden vegetables, but not so far that we stop the growth. Because if you move it all the way over here, the growth stops. So you set a whole bunch of fruit, but it doesn't mature. It doesn't fill out. It doesn't grow. So the art is keeping it right in here. And that has to do, again, with the more stable your calcium, the more easily you are to change what's happening with that fruit set versus growth process. Male, female. Vegetative is male, and fruiting is female. Now, recognize every cell is both all the time. But certain phases, whether you're in the vegetative stage or in the fruiting stage, are going to be dominated by the other hormone, the other side. And so you got a continuum going all the time. Nitrate nitrogen is going to be growth. Ammoniacal nitrogen is going to be fruiting. Okay? So you ask the question, why is it we have such a difficulty in getting off from anhydrous ammonia? Well, you're growing grain. And so what's happening is that if we just dump the anhydrous, we have to do something to make sure we produce enough ammoniacal nitrogen to get that fruit to set and grow. Okay? It's not just nitrogen that's at issue, it's what form is the nitrogen that is at issue. Okay? Sources, of course, a lot of different things, limestone and so on. We can do foliars, but it's more difficult to do foliars. If you're not organic, there are a few more available to you as far as calcium foliars are concerned, but it's a challenge getting calcium with phosphorus without them precipitating out. Plants grow from energy, that's really what it's about. We already talked about that a little bit. Glyphosate, unfortunately, it will reduce these nutrients, so it significantly reduces calcium concentrations of the grain. And some aspects of plant breeding and obtaining agricultural products on technologies contaminated lands is the name of the article. And that came out of the Russian Institute of Agriculture, Radiology, and Ecology. And so probably Monsanto or Bayer didn't buy that one. Potassium, it's a regulatory mechanism. It's also growth energy. So potassium is another growing thing here. Some potassium tidbits. And we need to keep it balanced. And the problem is that we have substituted potassium for calcium in most of our cropping systems. That's why we have so many disease problems, and that's why we've hit plateaus with yields. Is because we have substituted potassium for calcium. It's not that we need to throw out the potassium. It means that we got to bring the calcium in so that we get better efficiency out of our potassium in those. Sources, of course, sulfate's going to be your best one. I'd get rid of potassium chloride because, one, it's going to be eroded. Most of it's going to be leached. The other thing is it's hard on the microbes in the soil. If you want to make change, you get rid of potassium chloride. Yeah, I know it's cheap. And so that's the argument. But here's the research that was done at the Great Salt Lake Mineral Corporation in 1988. They looked at various sources of potassium. So potassium chloride, potassium sulfate, potassium phosphate, and they looked at leaching X number of time after rainfall inches. So if we had this is centimeters, inches, centimeter, inches, centimeter, inches, centimeter, inches, centimeter, inches, all right? So a 4-inch rain, we've just dropped 17% of our potassium is lost if we use potassium chloride. Well, I know you guys like to donate to the environment anyway, so after 8 inches of rain, we've lost 75%. So you've donated 75% of your potassium purchase to the environment. All right.
I got better places we can throw money away.
Yeah. So potassium sulfate, a 4-inch rain, you haven't lost any of it. How often do you get, heavy rains or accumulation over time? By the time you get out to the end of the season, you've already utilized a lot of that. So some of that's not going to go. But depending upon if you have a wet spring, you're going to lose a big portion of your potassium. Do you ever have wet springs? Huh. And so it has to do with how biologically fit that product is. In other words, how much the biology can take that and bind it so it's not leachable. So as well, it chelates your potassium, and so it will knock out your potassium. You're going to find lower potassium levels as well. It's a cation chelator. Nitrogen, we've already talked about those a little bit. Couple things there, of course. Nitrogen really correlates to insect pressure. Higher nitrogen, higher insect pressure. I didn't say higher protein level, higher amino acid level, higher nitrogen. It's always the free sources there that give us more and more problem. And so we need to really look at getting the biological system operating out here, understanding that there is a correlation between what goes on in you and what goes on in the soil. So what I'd like to do, we have, 20 minutes?
We've got about 30 minutes.
About 30 minutes. What I want to do is I wanted to have at least a half hour here so we can just answer questions and maybe address a few concerns that people may have. I know one thing was, and I see a question back there, was this tar spot. So somehow that slide got missing. I don't know, it's not in there. I had a tar spot slide. So tar spot. The actual tar spot itself is oxidized manganese. So tar spot is the consequence of glyphosate, just like xylella, just like a number of other diseases that have now emerged or reemerged because of glyphosate around the world. And so how does that mechanism operate? Well, first of all, what happens is the fungus that is actually, there's two fungus. There's a primary one and there's a secondary one that come in on the tar spot. And what's happened is that those are pretty much anaerobic fungi, and they're all around all the time. That's not the issue. The issue is that the glyphosate has killed off the reducing beneficials. And so there's nothing to keep these guys in check. And so they proliferate, and they are strong oxidizers of manganese. And so they oxidize the manganese that is in the soil, and if they get into the plant, that's in the plant. And so when it's oxidized, it precipitates. In other words, it drops out. And so it'll accumulate, and that's your tar spot on the leaf. So you do a tissue analysis. You send that tissue in to the standard lab, and they're going to tell you, oh, your manganese is fine. Well, yes, you have the mineral manganese there, but it's not in the functional form. It's an oxidized form. It's no good to you. It's no good to you. So the plant gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and of course the fungus takes over and knocks out your plant. So it's a glyphosate residue issue in the soil, and so there's two things that you need to do. One, obviously, we got to quit using glyphosate. Two, we have to get manganese and zinc into the system, and many of the places that are having various disease problems, we're finding that we have to use a phosphite form, at least partially, in order to get it transported in. You can't use that in organic operations, but you can otherwise. Why is that? Because glyphosate is an organophosphate, essentially, chelating agent. And so it is a very strong phosphate molecule. And so we have to put something in there that has equal or greater affinity for the mineral than does the glyphosate. And so we put it in there in a phosphite form, but we still need about 10% phosphate. Why? Because if all I put in is phosphite, I'll shut down my ATP in the plant and I'll actually reduce yield. So in order to bypass, in other words, what I've got to do, it's a cat and mouse game with glyphosate chelating my manganese and wanting to oxidize that manganese. So I have to play that cat and mouse game with a little bit of phosphite because it wins. And that then both manganese and zinc are the problem relative to solving that issue in there. It's no different than, like I said, a few other things. Xylella. Xylella is a bacteria that seems to be transported by various different thrips, sharpshooter and others, and it then plugs the sap. And that organism has proliferated again because of shutting down the beneficials. And you see it every place where glyphosate has been applied over the years. So citrus is a big place that they're seeing it. If you know anything about citrus greening down in Florida, promises to literally wipe out the citrus industry in Florida. And it's not that difficult to turn it around, but there's no drug or chemical that will do that. So. And it's the same thing with Panama disease in sugarcane, big problem, same thing. They've been using glyphosate as a desiccant. And so that's where that comes from. So people are wondering where are you getting the glyphosate in your food? You're getting it in all the grains. Yes?
So one of the big reasons that we asked Dr. Andersen to discuss this, this is not the only disease that we are dealing with or have dealt with in the past that the majority of the industry has said, you get it, sorry, there's nothing you can do. Because there is. Similar to Goss's wilt, similar to diplodia ear rot, similar to some of these other diseases that we can't control with a fungicide. We can't control it with a typical pesticide. There are ways. We're not always at the mercy of Mother Nature in conventional agriculture dictating how and what we do. But we only have control of these things if we understand the whys. If we understand the whys, we can prevent these things. And so this is a reason that we wanted Dr. Andersen to discuss this, because there was a bulletin or a paper just released here recently for some independent dollars in research, and then some private companies are throwing a ton of money. And how do we control this? We have that ability right now if we understand actually what's going on.
And there are actually some resistant varieties. What does a resistant variety mean? It means that it is stronger at reducing manganese and stimulating the microbes that will help to reduce manganese so that we don't lose it to oxidation. So, now there was a question in the back of the room earlier. Yes.
What the guy in the practices that we're doing now, and what I mean is following what Brad and Adam and AgriBiosystems are promoting, eliminating glyphosate, reducing / eliminating P and K, and increasing your biology. There's a lot of people out there that, will say, come to us and say, well, you better be careful, you're going to fall off a cliff because you're not doing some of these things.
Yeah.
And my question is, to those that are doing the conventional system of applying max anhydrous, max P, max K, when are they going to fall off the cliff?
Well, good question. When are they going to fall off the cliff? And who are doing the conventional approach and saying that, well, if you're not doing a conventional approach, eventually you're going to fall off the cliff. Many of them have already fallen off the cliff. That's what this stuff is about, is these emerging and re-emerging diseases that we thought were already taken care of. And now they're back. New thing. And, oh, gee, we can't control it. 68 resistant weeds now to glyphosate. Wait a minute, that was supposed to be the magic end-all herbicide. So if you happen to have that water hemp or whatever other weed variety that is resistant to glyphosate, what are you going to do? You're already off the cliff. And you're going to go back to previous approaches. And same thing with varieties. Now, the one thing I could never figure out, though, a little tongue-in-cheek here, I could never figure out why farmers so enjoy paying royalties. I just could never figure that out, why you so enjoy paying Monsanto royalties for crops. When the genetics are already there, actually are surpassed GMOs with non-GMO varieties. They're already there. They're already out there. And many people are growing them. And they're out-yielding conventional approaches. And prairie hybrids in Tampico, Illinois, they're an example of that. They grow non-GMO hybrid seed. And they've got the data to prove it. And there are other companies out there doing that. So as far as falling off the cliff, it's who defines the cliff? I mean, that's the bottom line. And so where I would look, and like I said, I've been to Australia quite a few times, and I look at the farmers down there, it costs them 30% more to grow across the board because of the cost of everything. There are no subsidies. So they're growing in a world market with no subsidies. 30% more cost of production. Pretty good operations. Pretty darn good operations. So it can happen. You can make a difference. You can survive it. But those farmers have been forced to look further down the road quicker and realize that, hey, this isn't going to work long term. And when they were looking at GMO cotton down the road earlier, when the second rollout of GMOs things, they figured out early on, wait a minute, these things got to have a lot more trace mineral foliars in order to produce. So they already figured out that they had to be more aggressive with nutrition up front. And so most of them, though, have figured out the biological approach. They have to. It's a dry continent. And so you don't get a second chance. You just don't get a second chance. And so I think you look at what you want to do 20 years from now. Some of you are young enough, you still may be farming, but certainly many of you want your children to be able to farm if they choose to. And many of you probably have kids that have already indicated they want to farm. Okay, so what's the farming operation going to look like 20 years from now? Now, we don't know all the technology and what, but we do know relative to production, safety, profitability, ability to survive independently. Because guess what? If you don't, the government's more than happy to come in and start putting more and more regulations on you. And they will. You already know that. Another question back here. Yes?
You haven't talked about sulfur.
Mm-hmm.
We're needing sulfur and
Yep.
that hasn't been brought up.
Thank you. Sulfur is definitely a very important nutrient. We have to have it for amino acid or protein production. We definitely need it for oil production. So soybeans Oil-producing bean has to have sulfur. And sulfur also is very important for better seed set. It's what we call a female energy-wise. And so most farmers don't make the connection that if you use potassium sulfate as opposed to potassium chloride, you're getting a nice dosage on a regular basis of sulfur, nutrient-wise, in the soil. So with one application, we're getting two nice things into the soil. So it also comes a little bit from gypsum. So if we're putting calcium sulfate out there, we're going to get a little sulfur from that. Gypsum is nice for helping to mellow the soil. It's more of a soil conditioner than anything else what we use it for, but it also provides a nice sulfur kick for us in that. And we don't have as much sulfur in most of our soils anymore because we don't have as many coal-burning power plants. I'm not promoting coal-burning power plants, but I'm saying in the past, because we had so many coal-burning power plants, there was a lot more sulfur in the air and it came down as a rain, and so we got a fair amount of sulfur in our soils in certain areas as a result of that. So absolutely we have to have sulfur. Many farmers will use sulfate traces, so manganese, copper, zinc, iron, sulfate as their trace source. May or may not be the best trace, but it does provide us with some sulfur. Yes, so absolutely, it's got to come. But I'm getting a lot of that with my gypsum. So it is included on our soil tests. So we want to be testing sulfur on a regular basis to make sure that we have that base in the soil. And it also is tested on the SAP test when we do SAP tests.
What rate on your gypsum per acre?
Typically 500 pounds. What rate on gypsum? Typically 500 pounds. If you can do it more frequently, then that's what I would do. Unfortunately, sometimes logistically, you don't have that option. Your lime applicators don't want to put down less than a ton. Most of them don't want to put down less than 2 tons. It's a little bit too much. And so, because they think, oh, we're getting calcium with that. But it's not a great source of functional calcium. So we use calcium carbonate if we want calcium. We use gypsum if we want a soil conditioner to help open it up, address some of our magnesium issues, and get some sulfur in there. So I'm looking at typically 500 pounds is what I would like to see, 500 to 1,000 pounds per
Does it
acre.
depend on fall versus spring applied?
If I can put it on in the fall, I'd love to do that. Sometimes logistics don't allow us to do that. So you put it on whatever you can put it on. Yes. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned you don't like human sludge. What about pig manure out of a pit or a lagoon?
Question is about sludge. No, I don't like sludge. What about pig manure out of a pit? What's going into the pigs? So I know I'm going to have glyphosate in it because most of the pig operations are using genetically engineered corn, so there's going to be glyphosate that's come through in the manure. So I know I'm applying some glyphosate through that too. What other drugs are in there? Antibiotics and various things that comes through, so I'm dumping that out there as well on my soil. And so I am going to have to deal with that in a biological system. And then am I getting an accumulation of any heavy metals? So I want to look at that. May or may not be, but I need to look at that. So I need to have it analyzed for all of those kinds of things. And then don't bury it. Do not bury it, because I've got an anaerobic product that I bury and I put it down into an anaerobic zone. So now I'm going to have anaerobic compounds, and formaldehyde is one of those anaerobic compounds that will be formed. And so we will see it in the soil. We will see it in the soil. I don't. Can you get by with, I mean, there are ways that we can address that, but burying it is not the way that we're going to address it. So we're going to have to keep it up higher. We're going to have to get it mixed with something else, maybe lime, maybe as simple as putting some lime with it to help us with that, aerate it. Maybe there's some microorganisms that we can put with it when it's going out in order to help us along with that process. There's no free lunch. There's no free lunch, and what we hear all the time is, oh, it's very inexpensive NPK. No, it's never inexpensive. There's a consequence down the road with that. Salt is another thing you got to look at too, is how much salt's going out with that, because they're feeding pigs salt. So, Other questions?
Tom, did you have another?
What about gypsum with that, pig manure?
Yeah, that's a possibility too. Yeah, we'll throw a little gypsum in with that. Help it.
What about, I always heard that turkey manure doesn't have near the calcium in it that chicken manure has, or layer manure.
Yeah, good question. Calcium in chicken manure versus turkey manure. It all depends upon what they're feeding them. So you have to kind of look at that. And you still have to look at what's the residue, what's going through the bird. One of the things that of late has been discussed a little bit more in human nutrition is arsenic, because they use arsenic in the birds. It's an antibiotic in order to increase bird production. That arsenic is coming through in the manure, and you're dumping that arsenic out on the field.
Another thing, what would you, in chicken manure or turkey manure, what would you put? Some of the products like fish, sea crop, humates, humate acid, things like that. Would
The
you
question
put-
is, what things would I put with the bird manure? I don't want to put things in there that I can lose. So I'm very careful about putting worm castings and that kind of stuff with it, unless I can absolutely guarantee it's going to stay aerobic. So if there's a chance it's going to go anaerobic, I'm doing myself a disfavor, because now my nice worm castings becomes anaerobic. It goes to formaldehyde and other salts that I don't want. So humates is a reasonable choice. The powdered humates, or even humic acid, is a reasonable choice to put out there with that, because in that way, biologically, it's a little bit more inert. And if it goes anaerobic for a little while, typically I'm not going to have a problem with humates, humic acid, because it's a chemical product as opposed to a biological product per se in there. And I'm going to analyze what do I have in the product and make that decision logistically, what can I put with it. It's nice for me to stand up here and tell you, you need to put this in and put that in and so on. I've done let's put the humates on there thing as you're coated with dust from the humates and so on. So it's a very, very fine powder. It's very difficult to deal with. So you've got to be logistically set up to be able to add those things in and blend them and then apply them. And so there's some logistical stuff with that. So things that you can easily mix together are really what we got to talk about. And they may have to be separate applications. So you may have to spread the manure and then come out and spread the gypsum separately on top of that. But if you put lime down, always have a carbon with it. So that's why I like humates to go with that, or even molasses or something like that, so we don't lose our calcium. Yep. Yes?
Probiotics in humans.
Yes?
Is that something we should be taking to help offset some of this?
Probiotics in humans, should that be something we should always take to offset this? Yes and no. If you happen to have SIBO, which is small bowel, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, if you take a probiotic, you'll be worse. So that doesn't work for you. The other thing is that it's also dose dependent. So if I'm going to take a probiotic, and I do prescribe probiotics, and periodically I'll take them, not a lot, but periodically. Well, I won't very often because I've had SIBO. And you get SIBO because of long-term use of antibiotics. So I grew up on antibiotics, basically. And so it wipes out your gut and it just changes the flora. So typically, minimum of 20 billion colony count 3 times a day. And there is a product out there called Probiotic 225, which is 225 billion colony count. It comes in a little packet. It's in a box of 15, and we'll have people take one a week, so that we actually get therapeutic levels to actually make change in the gut. And most of the over-the-counter stuff, you go to Walmart or whatever and you buy the little over-the-counter one, it's 2.5, 5 billion, whatever, great. So it's expensive because it's not going to do much unless you take 10 of them 3 times a day. Okay. So you've got to have a therapeutic level in order to actually make change. The next thing is that what else are you doing in order for that biology to survive the gut? So that has to do with your diet, your supplements, your water quality, all of those things. But they can be quite valuable, particularly I find, just from an easy transient thing. Let's say you travel to Mexico and you pick up Montezuma's Revenge. Yeah, you're going to need probiotics in order to help reconstitute that gut and help you. Okay? So those kinds of things, yeah. Food poisoning, absolutely, you need to get the good probiotics back in there. But you got to have the therapeutic dose, at least 30 billion 3 times a day to make that change.
How long in the human or in your soils do we have the effects of glyphosate? You know, if we quit using glyphosate today on our farm, how many years are we still going to feel the effects of that? And then same for if you changed your diet, you know, on that and didn't eat foods, how long is that?
Good question of how long are we going to have the glyphosate residue in the soil? Well, the Danish study said 22.5 years is the half-life of glyphosate. We don't know. We just do not know. And because so much of it is continuing to be used. In the human body, like I said, my wife and I are pretty much organic. She's really a Nazi when it comes to that as far as making that selection. And yet her urinalysis showed she was dumping a fair amount of glyphosate. So where are we getting it? I'd like to know. We don't eat 100% organic because that's simply not available. So are we getting it from, well, we know we're getting it from grains, some grains. Particularly if we eat out at a restaurant, they're not organic, it's in the grains. Everything grown in Canada has glyphosate on it because they use it as a desiccant before harvest. So every grain grown in Canada, unless it's organic, has glyphosate on it. But we're also getting drift. It's in the rainwater. U.S. Geological Survey have shown that. It's in the rainwater. And so it's in a lot of wells. And what are we going to do about that? So the bottom line is that I can't answer that question. I don't know how long we're going to be dealing with it. What are we going to do about it really is the bigger issue, which means nutrition is a key thing. So like that issue there, we've got to be more aggressive with our manganese and our zinc foliar sprays in order to counter this. That's what we have to do. We have to look at the patient. In other words, we have to look at the crop, not the tissue analysis. Because if you're starting to get tar spot, you're oxidizing that manganese. I've got to get manganese out there, period. And that's the only way I'm going to counter that process once I already have it. Now I've got to prevent it by getting my biology in there, getting enough carbon and so on to tie up the glyphosate and or to gradually start getting it broken down over time. How long does that take? I don't know. I don't know. We don't know because we still see it. It's in the rainwater. So we know that we can compensate for it in our foliar sprays. We also know that organic farms that may have been organic for 10 years, they're still there. So we have to compensate for that. And it is just the reality. We have to compensate for it. And so that means in all of our analyses, we have to take it into consideration and to just bump things up a little bit and make sure, hey, I've got to make sure I'm covering this manganese. Now, could I get manganese toxicity? Sure, you can get toxicity of anything. So I have to just be aware of that as well. And that's why it's so important, get out into the field and we actually have to be looking at things. That's why we're doing the SAP testing in addition or as opposed to the tissue testing. Now there's a few guys that are really good at tissue testing. Michael McNeil's one, Don Huber's one, another one. They can read a tissue test and their numbers are all different than what the recommendations are. But that comes with Don's in his 80s and Michael's in his 70s. You know, that comes with 40 plus years of School of Hard Knocks. And you got to remember, those guys came up before they had all this fancy equipment as well. So they actually had to learn from practical exchange with those things. So diet is a real important thing. So you have to minimize exposure as much as possible. So that means we avoid the GMO stuff as much as possible. And then we got to have clean water, and so that we're not adding it in the water itself. And unfortunately, a lot of people are drinking tap water, they're drinking well water, they're drinking city water. All of those are contaminated. And so you got to get an RO system in the house. We have one in our house. We have an RO system that we don't drink anything but RO water in the house. We don't cook with anything but RO water. And so you have to do those things that you can do and not worry about it after that.
What's RO water?
Reverse osmosis. So basically it is a very fine filtration system that is going to, depending upon how much money you spend for the filters, can take things all the way down to taking chemicals out of the water. So it'll take iron out, it'll take any of those things. So we put that under the, I think ours was, I don't know, $1,000 or something like that. So it's under the sink, separate system comes to that. And then there's a little spout that comes out next to our regular water spout, which is what we use. And
I thought we needed to drink all the minerals.
well, perhaps if we were 1,000 years ago, maybe so. But we're not there now. And the minerals now have been contaminated. A lot of them are unbalanced. There's chemicals in the water that we don't need. So I'd rather start with clean water and get those nutrients in there through the food I eat and through the supplementation that I take in. Okay? Yes?
Can you touch real quick on the 80-20 rule of crop growth, and then also real quick on the importance of paramagnetism?
All right, 80-20 rule. So, got your crop above ground. Couple ears off from there, and of course our roots. And we have our sun over here. So, if you do a mineral analysis on your corn, and we had a couple of them back there, what total percentage ash do you typically find? Total percentage of ash. Less than 10%, typically, yes? Ash content, 4.5%, 5%, somewhere in that range. Yes? Don't know. Typically, that's what you're going to have. All right? What's ash? Mineral. Ash is mineral. Okay? So if we have 100 pounds of crop that comes off, let's say that I just erased this whole thing there, that 100 pounds of crop came off. Okay? There should be an equal amount of crop volume below ground in the root system. Now the problem with a lot of modern agriculture, we have so messed up the soil, we don't have a real good root structure. So we may not have an equal amount there, but we should have. We should have an equal volume below ground as we have above ground. So we should have 100 pounds of residue that actually stayed there. That's if we took everything off out here. Now, if you're just harvesting corn and beans, you're not taking 100% of everything off. You're getting some residue back in there. But let's say we got 100 pounds there. Okay, where did that 100 pounds come from? So, what do we get from the air? CO2 and sunlight, yes? So CO2 and sunlight. And what does that turn into? Sugar. And that sugar then turns into what? Fats, starch or sugars, amino acids, organic acids. Yes? Huh? All of it comes from sugar. What's that sugar come from? Oh, there's one other thing here. Water. Water and CO2, right? Water and CO2. And sunlight. So typically 80% is going to come from the air of that 100 pounds. 20% is going to come from the soil. See, oh, well, that's just not possible. Well, if we do an ash analysis of this, how much mineral do we find? Less than 10%. So if that is, because, well, how much moisture is in it typically in our whole crop? It's just about 80% moisture, correct? So we're getting a lot of it is water. But in order to form sugar, sugar is what's going to form all of these other things for us. And that sugar comes dominantly from carbon dioxide with a little bit of moisture. And you can do the molecular numbers on how much that actually weighs. But the bottom line is that it comes from sugar. Dominantly, that sugar is coming from carbon dioxide and oxygen, but carbon dioxide is the heaviest, and sunlight. And so I take 100 pounds off. 80% of that 100 pounds came from the air, essentially. And 20% of it came from the soil. So what that means is that of that 100 pounds, 20 pounds of it came from the soil. So that means I've got 80 pounds came from the air that I'm taking off. So I didn't extract anything. What I extracted was 20 pounds from the soil out of that 100 that I removed. But I also have 100 pounds that was generated in the soil, 80 of which came from the air. So if 80 of it came from the air, minus my 20, that leaves me still with 60 pounds net. So every year that you farm, this is obviously if you're at 100% efficiency. So that's our goal, is to move in that direction. So every year that you farm, you're only taking 20 off. So we're going to subtract that 20 from here. Plus, we've got to, I already subtracted the other 20 from there. So we should still be getting a net of 60 pounds added to the soil every single year of carbonaceous material, because that's where it came from originally. It's carbonaceous material. However, our soils have lost carbon over time. Our soils getting weaker and weaker over time. And we have to hammer them harder and harder in order to get production out of it. So as we start turning around, we start getting more and more efficient, which means this air, this photosynthesis efficiency begins to improve even further. And so we get closer and closer and closer to that full 80% coming off from the air because of sunlight, carbon dioxide, and moisture. And we get a lot of moisture from the air, do we not? It's called dew. So we can utilize a significant amount of that dew, provided we have a magnet in order to take care of that. Now, how does this system operate? Well, it's all about physics. And the reality is that we have actually an electrical system. We have an alternating electrical system. It's called night and day. And that electrical system as well, having to do with the electromagnetic field of the Earth, courses across north to south. So on the surface of the Earth, you have an electromagnetic field running this direction, and we have plants that run perpendicular to that. So what happens? You have a magnetic field, and perpendicular to all magnetic fields is what? An electrical field. If you look at how a generator operates or an electric motor, you set up an electric field, 90 degrees to that is a magnetic field. So if you set up a magnetic field, 90 degrees to that is an electric field. Why is that important? Because this is all about physics. The movement of nutrients back and forth in the cell, in the plant, is about exchange of electrical charge. It's about exchange in electrical charge, positive and negative, back and forth all the time. And so what we find, and Phil Callahan actually did this work originally, he was interested in the megalithic tombs and round towers of Ireland. And unfortunately, I was able to take 2 trips with him back in the 80s and do some of that research with him. And he was looking at it from a health perspective and why the round towers are built the way they're built and what they're made of and so on and so forth. And he came up with what's called magnetic, well, he didn't come up with it, but applied what's called magnetic susceptibility. Magnetic susceptibility, and what you have is you have ferromagnetism, you have paramagnetism, you have diamagnetism, and what that means is that it has to do with what does that item, how does that item respond to a magnetic field, in other words, a magnet. So if you take a selenium cobalt magnet and you suspend it from a string, and I take a ferromagnetic material like a standard nail, what will that nail do with that magnet suspended from a string? It'll bring that magnet to it, will it not? Or vice versa, I hold the magnet and suspend the nail from the string, boom, it'll come right to it, right? What happens if I take a wire and wrap around that nail and hook that to a battery? What's happened to that nail? Now I have an electromagnet. I can then pick up other nails with that electromagnet. So that ferromagnetic material, a nail, is magnetizable. Okay? And it will come to a magnet. A paramagnetic material will do the same. Healthy soil is highly paramagnetic. In other words, if I take a chunk of that soil and I suspend this selenium cobalt magnet, why it's selenium cobalt magnet? Because it's a high Gauss, it's small, and I can demonstrate it on a string. It will be attracted to that soil particle or that rock mineral particle if I have that, okay? However, let's say that I come up and make you a paramagnetic. Basalt is oftentimes paramagnetic. So let me make a nail out of that paramagnetic material. So I'm going to wrap a wire around it again and hook that to a magnet. What happens? Nothing. It does not become magnetized. It is not magnetizable because it is not ferromagnetic. Ferromagnetic means full of iron, typically. So even though it is attracted to the magnet, I can't magnetize it. Next is a diamagnetic material. It's the opposite. So in other words, if I have that and I bring the magnet closer to it, it'll repel. It'll push away from the magnet. Okay? And it is also not magnetizable. So what does that have to do with plants? Healthy soil. The healthier the soil becomes, the more paramagnetic it becomes. The healthier the plant, the more diamagnetic it becomes. So I'm putting opposite charges in there. So what happens when you put opposite charges? Fireworks. Things happen. Growth, change. What we see as we farm conventionally, these soils over time become more and more and more neutral. They become less paramagnetic. So less paramagnetic, that means we have less differential. So if you know anything about a battery, what does charging a battery mean? You cause a significant differential between the positive and the negative plates. Yes? Isn't that what it means if I charge up a tractor battery? And when it is decharged or uncharged or discharged, what does that mean? They're neutral. They've equalized. The opposite sides of the plates, the positive and negative, now have neutralized. So I have no net exchange in electricity, in electrons. So I have no movement. Okay? So what do I have to do in order to charge that battery? I have to cause a differential. And the greater the differential, the more discharge, more power I get from that battery potentially, okay? It's the same thing with a plant. So the greater differential I have between a paramagnetic soil and a diamagnetic plant, the greater amount of fireworks, the greater amount of energy exchange, the greater amount of crop growth I get.
When you look at things with this thought process, is this why some of the foliar applications that we do just go gangbusters because we've taken out a lot of mineral variability in the soil already? And with foliar, it's exactly what it needs and it really kicks it off.
Yes, his question was, is this why sometimes we'll see that a foliar works great? We've balanced nutrients a little bit better and it really takes off, and others it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, the greater differential you have, again, the greater potential you have for energy exchange. It's just a battery. That's all it is. And so how do we improve that? Foliar sprays is one of the ways that we improve that. There are 3 ways to increase paramagnetism in the soil. 3 ways. Number 1, you add paramagnetic rock. That's a little expensive, particularly, you're farming 10,000 acres, you need to put on 10 ton per acre of paramagnetic rock. You probably won't be farming very much afterwards because you'll be bankrupt. All right? But that is one way of doing it. Why did I say 10 tons? Because the work done by Boral out of Australia, that was the sweet spot in maximizing paramagnetism in the soil, because they looked at various different dosages, all the way up to 20 tons. These are greenhouse studies that they did, And what they found out, 10 tons was the sweet spot. That's where you maximize the curve. After that, you didn't increase the curve any. So 10 tons. I mean, you put 500 pounds on, you're getting some benefit, but logistically speaking, we can't be moving all of our mountains to our prairie lands. It's not logistically practical. But we still can use some of those minerals in small doses in a practical basis. So, one, we can add the mineral, okay? And you definitely could do that in a garden. You can definitely do that in a greenhouse. You can definitely do that with potted plants in small locations. No question about it, you can do that. You can afford that. Number two, oxygen. Oxygen is one of the most paramagnetic elements you'll find. Well, don't we want to make this more aerobic? We're going to open this up, aerate it. Don't we talk about aeration in the soil? So our aeration in the soil helps to increase paramagnetism in the soil. All right? And number three, biology. It's structure. Microorganisms structure the soil, and structure increases magnetic susceptibility because you set up an antenna, basically. So we can change this by getting the microorganisms in there and getting the nutrient in there through the plants. We can change that. So now when you want to talk about genetic potential, it's understanding how this battery operates and what do I need to do in order to get that battery to maximize its functionality, and then simply increase the battery itself over time. Okay. Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you. And the interesting thing is, I have been around the world. I've seen farms in all walks of life and things. And I want to make sure I say this to every farmer that I see. You hold in your hands, the well-being of your fellow human beings. You do. You truly do. I don't care what you grow. You're farmers, you hold in your hands the well-being of your fellow human beings. That is a tremendous mission. Whether you believe it spiritually or not, that is a tremendous mission. It is also a great honor to be that important to your fellow human beings. And so I thank you for what you do, because you wouldn't be here today if you weren't at least interested in improving the lot of your farms, and your farms are part of a community, which is part of a country and part of a planet. So thank you as well for all that you do. And if I can be of further service, just ask. So thank you very much, Brad.
Thank you.